I come at these issues as someone who works and teaches in criminal justice, both in China, and about the United States. And even during the Obama administration, I was already getting concerned about the way the US government was discussing foreign threats in general, but increasingly about China. So you saw increasing use, for example, of economic espionage. This is taking trade secret theft and elevating it to a national security concern and a very serious federal crime. You also saw the FBI putting together more threat awareness briefings, threat awareness films. You can Google Company Man, Game of Pawns, but getting out the message that there was a concern about national security threats coming from China, and these were being dealt with through the criminal law. So when we fast forward to November of 2018, which is, it's actually not that long ago, but it feels long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, given where we are today. But then Jeff Sessions was Attorney General. He stands up and he announces this China initiative. It is highly unusual, if not unprecedented, to have the name of a place, of a country, be the name of an initiative by the Department of Justice. And again, this wasn't completely new. It wasn't like the China initiative in November 2018 sprung fully formed from the head of the Department of Justice. There were already concerns, but you saw then a real coalescing and an enhancing of resources looking at a China threat. And this has only gained momentum under Attorney General Barr. He has praised the China initiative. You have the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, speaking about 1,000 approximately active investigations across the United States that are tied to the China initiative. I think it's important to say this doesn't tell us what the prevalence of criminal behavior is, but it does tell us that the US government is putting significant resources behind the China initiative and that really trying to root out what's happening. And then the question is how much attrition there will be from these investigations, because of course, many will not actually result in prosecutions and convictions. Now, the heart of the China initiative are these concerns about espionage, about intellectual property theft, and the quintessential case there being the stealing of the arm of Tappy the robot out of the T-Mobile lab in Washington, physically trying to take the intellectual property. But it's not just about protecting IP. You also see what Rory Truex at Princeton, another PIPper, another Public Intellectual Program Fellow who's working on these issues, what he calls compromising relationships. This idea that there are people who have ties to the PRC, universities there, the government, and that either they should have been disclosing and they have not, or they otherwise are making them a national security concern. And for this, you look to the prosecution that's going on right now of Professor Lieber at Harvard. And so he is being prosecuted federally, essentially because of false statements, that he didn't disclose his connections to a university in China and receipt of significant money under these talent recruitment plans, the 1,000 Talent Initiative and other similar programs. So that's another concern of the China initiative, is who has ties to China, and those have not been disclosed as they were required to be under federal law. Now, I came to this partially too because about a year ago, or even less, so November of 2019, the District of New Jersey reached out to Seton Hall to ask if we could host one of these threat awareness briefings. And they wanted us to give them a chance, as they do all over the US, to reach out to industry. Big Pharma is in New Jersey. And as part of hosting this threat awareness briefing, they got me on the panel, which was part of the bargain. But it was really interesting for me to hear the language being used, this whole of government threat, the response, the whole of society threat, that China being presented as an existential threat to the United States. And you see that language also being used in, for example, in February, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC hosted a almost full day conference on the China initiative. Attorney General Barr spoke, Director Wray spoke, a number of the US attorneys spoke. And the way that they present the nature of this threat is existential, is that, will the world go through the US or through China in the future? And so there's a real sense of this is a dire security threat that needs to be addressed. Now, what was posted along with the materials for today is a forthcoming article, which is very much in draft stage. And that is, it's at heart a crim theory piece. I'm asking, what are the standards that the Department of Justice sets for itself? And does this initiative live up to those standards? And first, what is even the China of the China initiative? And the note of that is the PRC party state, the PRC government. But one problem I have is that when the PRC party state is discussed, you often get this language of communist China, and which conveys a certain kind of threat, and also parts of our history, which I don't think we want to revisit. But beyond sweeping the government, which is what we should be concerned about, I think, you also get in the China initiative framing and in the way it's carried out, language that includes within this idea of China, peoples whose DNA is connected to China, that they are ethnically Han Chinese or other ethnicities, that they hold a passport, their nationality is that of the PRC, their national origin was, even if they've since changed their nationality, and even more broadly, what I call people who have connections that gives them a sense of China-ness. And by that, I mean, you will have prosecutions and convictions under the China initiative of people who are white, who have no apparent physical connection to China. But in the press releases, you'll sometimes have language like, and he speaks fluent Chinese, which, I wonder, why is that relevant to the press release? Are we supposed to now be wary of someone who speaks fluent Chinese? So I think that this concept of China is way too broad as it's being used by the US government. And then secondly, I go into my piece, and I won't do a lot here with this, about the principles behind punishment. Because if the Department of Justice is going to bring a criminal prosecution, that's a huge decision. I mean, we're taking away people's liberty with oftentimes that we prosecute people because they think they're worthy of punishment. And why do we punish people? To deter, to incapacitate, to rehabilitate, and because we think retribution is deserved. And even looking under these basic principles, I think the China initiative is problematic, in part because I fear over-deterrence the way it's being carried out, and sometimes under-deterrence, that we're so focused on one threat, what are we not looking at by putting those blinders on? Rehabilitation is certainly not a focus here. Incapacitation, are we building walls and the decoupling that comes with some of these decisions? And retribution. There's a sense that somehow people are more morally blameworthy because of the IP theft being connected somehow to the PRC. And then also in the China initiative, it's like China is being anthropomorphized into an actor itself. So you'll have Attorney General Barr talk about China's malign behavior, or that we need to deter China. And China is not an actor that can be subject to the criminal law. And that gives me this overall sense that I worry that we've got the Department of Justice taking on both a national security role and dealing with individual criminal prosecutions. And that creates tension. And I don't think it's being addressed fully. And also we get this sense of the ratcheting up of the national security concerns. And this is where I think we need to think about, even though national security is so important when we think about the US-China relationship, are we over-securitizing? Are we putting too much emphasis? Especially now where we really need the cooperation. I mean, we need cooperation scientifically. The US benefits from cooperation and from open borders. Today, Marco Polo just came out with a report about flows of talent for artificial intelligence and how much the US has benefited from those flows from China to the US. And the more we erect barriers to having that talent come to the US, we're hurting ourselves. And it's not just talent from China. These tend to also lead to more general barricades to foreign nationals, for foreigners coming to the US. And so it has a broader concern there too. So that's my kind of 30,000 word monster, which is in the draft stage. So I want to make 3 points clear and then just finish with a few suggestions before I end. First, I want to be clear, there is a threat. There is no doubt that people connected to the PRC party state are engaged in IP theft and other acts that are illegal under US law. But I think we need to think very carefully about what is the scope and the nature of that threat and what is the best response. Second, that the beyond a reasonable doubt standard has not been relaxed. This is not blunt guilt by association. I do, though, think that there is threat by association, that people with certain connections to China are being viewed with enhanced scrutiny, and we need to think of that fair. And third, I want to emphasize how much we don't know. that prosecutors are a notoriously opaque part of our government. It's really hard to know what they're doing, and it makes it even harder when there's this national security overlay. And I'm sure Eliza Orlins could tell us a gazillion stories about times she wanted something from prosecutors in New York City for a non-national security case and they didn't give it to her, right? So part of it is that it makes it hard to do a regression analysis and say at what percentage higher are people of certain, Chinese ethnicity being prosecuted, because we just don't know. We need more information from the government. But I applaud efforts to try to do that. But even if we don't have that empirical analysis of X higher rate of prosecutions, at a minimum, the initiative goes against the fundamental desire for non-discrimination, which is embedded in the principles that drive the Justice Department. It is at least in tension, and I think undermines it. And second, I think we can just do a better job of protecting interests. Instead of saying, you see like John Demers, who's the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, saying, I want to see each of the 94 U.S. Attorney's offices having a case under the China Initiative. Like, that starts sounding a lot like a quota. You go find it. Instead of doing that, I want the U.S. government to identify what are the assets, what are the things we want to protect, and then we protect those IP, those national security, the launch codes from threats wherever they come from. That's how I'd rather have us go about this. Identify what's important and then protect those without saying we've already decided who is the threat to those interests. How to make this better? Ditch the China Initiative name. It's doing no good. I think a country-neutral framing is critical for non-discrimination reasons. Second, we need more intra-government cooperation. The Department of Justice is not and I'm sure there's people right now who are on this from the US government who are laughing, because I know it's very hard to get cooperation within the government. Easy to say from the ivory tower. But the reality is the Department of Justice does not have deep country and linguistic expertise. They have someone from the FBI, usually in the embassy in Beijing, an assistant US attorney. They have an Office of International Affairs. But the people I see working on this don't seem to know a lot about China, and that worries me. I also think we need to build non-criminal alternatives. We generally don't want to go to the criminal law as our first line of defense. We want to find ways, whether it be through auditing mechanisms, better scrutiny of grants. The Department of Justice itself says don't prosecute when there's an adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. There are efforts to start looking at ways to do that, but they need to go further. We need to look at Congress, because Congress writes the laws that the Department of Justice actually enforces. So if there's bad laws, it's probably going to make it easier to have bad prosecutions. We need also better cooperation between the government and the private sector, academia and businesses. You're starting to see that. The FBI had an academic summit last year. That's harder now with COVID. But my sense, and talking to people, is that it's still more the FBI and Department of Justice more generally, either coming to say, here is the threat and describe it, or wanting information, rather than working collaboratively really with academia and the private sector to figure out how to deal with this. And then finally, in my last minute or so, I want to, with Steve starting, mentioning where our country is now, and I think that's so important here, because it's not just where our country is, but where our planet is. And I teach criminal procedure. I am discussing with my students right now about what it means to have another unarmed Black man killed at the hands of the police. And the protests are so much focused on the cops on the street, but that, pushing out of not just racism, but all kinds of bias needs to occur from the cop on the beat all the way to the Attorney General. And we're seeing here too with COVID increasing discrimination against people of Asian heritage. And I applaud the National Committee, which has been doing programming on that. And I encourage people to follow that. But what work is being done not only to root out the explicit bias, the racism that's so much a part of our country, but the implicit bias. So you'll see members of the Department of Justice say, yeah, we have the China Initiative, but we love the Chinese people. And we welcome the Chinese people. And, for me, I hear that as a woman who, when someone says something sexist to me, if they then say, but I'm not sexist, that doesn't mean what they just said wasn't sexist. It just meant they just invalidated my lived experience. And that serves as a micro invalidation of the discrimination people are facing, rather than as an antidote to this overall framing. So I want to know what work is being done, because ultimately what I would love to see is that we come out of all these hard times with a more just Justice Department. So I'll leave it there and open it up to Steve and wherever the questions go.